This is my Sony Burano video. Now, because I've only had this camera for a short period of time, this is not going to be an exhaustive review, but I will share some test results with you and tell you why I went from being possibly the most excited I've ever been about a camera to feeling kind of lukewarm about it. But first, you should know that Sony did lend me this camera to make this video. I wasn't compensated in any way, and this isn't sponsored by Sony, and I have to send it back today, actually, after I'm finished filming. And I'm also not a filmmaker. I don't shoot docs. I don't work on narrative sets. So take my opinion with a grain of salt, because it's really just coming from a person who is enthusiastic about cameras and has tested a lot of them. So I do have some perspective based on comparisons with things in the market. And lastly, this is your opportunity to go and grab a snack, because I don't know how long this video is going to be, because it's unscripted. It's going to be ranty. There's going to be jump cuts. I just want to unload everything I've been thinking about this camera. So let's get started. First of all, why was I so excited? Well, think about the combination of features and the novelty here. I love that this hasn't been done before and that they did it successfully for the most part. You've got IBIS, autofocus, built-in variable ND. It's compatible with PL lenses and with Sony E-mount lenses. And you can do all this stuff in conjunction. If you put on an E-mount lens, you have different levels of IBIS and it autofocuses. Like, it's crazy that it can do all that. And a lot of this stuff was limited before. People were like, well, you can't possibly combine an ND and an IBIS. It just doesn't work. Well, it's like, look, it works, and it's excluding the body, but that sensor platform is reasonably compact. So maybe there's also future potential there, which is what I'm most excited about. But for me, I was thinking, but it's also supposed to be kind of like a Venice. So we're going to get crazy fast readout speeds, really good dynamic range, and a built-in variable ND, and IBIS, and autofocus. It's going to be able to do everything and do it the best. And so I think that's where some of the disappointment toward this camera came from, but I think that's on us, because we forgot that a machine that's purpose-built to do one thing will always outperform a machine that's built to do it all. And that's what we have here with the Burano, a machine that can do it all, but doesn't really do any one thing exceptionally well, other than that it does all those things, if that makes sense. Let's jump into some test results first, because I want to provide some evidence for the rest of the ramblings that I'm about to do. Okay, let's start here with rolling shutter, because I think this is probably the best way to talk about the different readout modes before getting in the dynamic range of those modes, but also the readout speeds were one of the most contentious things about this camera when the test results started to come out. So here we've got 8.6K. I think I did this in RAW, but it's the same in the H.265 mode. It's the full readout of the sensor. By the way, if I say H.265, I might say HEVC. What I mean is the new XAVC HI codec that's in this camera. It's a new, H.265 all-intra codec. And I think there's still some minor compatibility issues with certain NLEs. It was working for me in Resolve as of the latest update, but there is a quirk when compared to the RAW. They don't quite match. It's almost like the lift is up like 1 point. The blacks just aren't quite the same. Anyway, full readout, I got 18.8 milliseconds, which, yeah, for a $25,000 cinema camera, it's a lot. 18.8 milliseconds is definitely more than people were expecting when you pay that kind of money. And I'm going to reference the A1 a lot here, because the A1's actually slightly better in its 8K mode, and it costs a fifth of that. Anyway, now the Burano has a full frame C mode that they have in 6K, which is slightly faster at 17.6 milliseconds. And some people have noticed that it's slightly softer, which I guess makes sense when you learn about all the stuff that it's doing. Pre the process of like debarriering and all that, they're taking the data using like a oversampling method that they're not really sharing. But their method was just like, maybe we can give people almost the same feel as the 8K, but for much smaller data rates. I'm not sold on this as a concept. I think they should have gone with like a 4K pixel bin method or something, but it is slightly faster. Slightly. Probably not worth it for the rolling shutter improvement to switch to the mode or the diminished sharpness. You could argue that maybe the data rates are important, but I don't know. Then we have the Super 35 5.8K mode, which is like a true 6K, but it's cropped in, 1.5 times into the sensor, and that is faster, as you would expect, 12.6 milliseconds. And then we have the Super 35C, which is basically like a 2x punch-in. It's like a Micro Four Thirds. It's got a GH5 built into this camera, if you want. And that's 8.5 milliseconds. So if you want to match those like A7S3, FX3 speeds, you have to get all the way into 4K. And Sony will say, look, we have all of the same speeds or better than the other cameras that people are comparing it to. And they do, but you're sacrificing field of view. You're not getting full frame to get 8 seconds, but yes, you are getting 4K at 8 seconds like the A7S3, but it's like a 2x crop. Sony A1, look at that, 7.9 milliseconds. That's the A1, that's the Alpha 1's 4K pixel bin mode. See, the Alpha 1 has 8K, but if you switch to 4K, they're all pixel bin, which means you can do 4K 24, 30, 60, 120 without changing field of view. The image quality is worse than the 8K for sure, but I did a comparison back when I reviewed the Alpha 1, and it was hard to tell the difference between it and an A7S III. So the pixel binned 8K on the Alpha 1 looks like the 1:1 4K on the A7S III and reads out at about the same speed. So it has an A7S III built into the Alpha 1. It's incredible. So why is there no 4K pixel bin mode on the Burano? Because that would solve a lot of complaints. It would say, look, you want the 8K resolution, you want all the data rates, slower readout speed, but you can pixel bin 4K, still get a full frame image, and shoot that all intra, much lower data rates, and the rolling shutter is only 8 milliseconds. But it's just not in there. I don't know why. Moving on. Sony Alpha 1 at 8K 24. 15.2 milliseconds. Again, faster than the 17, 18 milliseconds you're going to see on the Burano. Now, they're completely different cameras, but I just want to point out, we have a sensor here that can read 8K at 15 something milliseconds, and over here, it's 17, 18 milliseconds. It's strange, right? Okay, I've got a lot of dynamic range test results here because there's a lot of different modes and comparisons, so I'm going to try to breeze through them pretty quickly. But for people who aren't familiar with this is Imatest, and up at the top here, you're going to see what codec combination I was using, and then over here are results. I filmed something called the Xyla 21, which is a step chart, has 21 stops, and it will give us a score over here that says slope-based DR. That's the total number of stops detected, and then below that is a signal noise ratio tolerance. So medium, the 0.5, that's a signal noise ratio of 2, and that's normally what we use to assess an acceptable level of noise. Basically, whatever score you get at medium, those are good, clean stops. So this here on the top, you'll see it says 8K on 8K raw. That means it was 8K on an 8K timeline, so there's no downsampling going on here. And it's EI800 and no noise reduction, because one of the great things about the Burano compared to something like the Alpha 1 is that you can control your noise reduction. Now you'll see that we get 14.4 stops total with a medium score of 10.9. And this isn't great when it comes to a cinema camera, in my opinion, but it's also the worst it's going to be because it's only going to go up from here as we involve oversampling and noise reduction. But it also gives us an idea of maybe whereabouts the A1 would be if we could turn off its noise reduction and shoot the same raw codec, no oversampling and that kind of thing on an 8K timeline, we'd probably get a similar dynamic range. But that's also part of the problem. Why are we getting a similar dynamic range between a mirrorless camera that costs a fifth of the price and a cinema camera? This is 8K on 8K timeline raw with medium noise reduction, which is actually similar to the noise reduction that's baked in an Alpha 1. And you can see that we go from 10.9 to 11.8, so it's a significant uptick. But I think that the noise on the Burano actually looks nice. I've actually preferred it to the Alpha 1 with the baked-in noise reduction because you do get a bit of a bit more detail, and there's like a finer grain to it where it hasn't been kind of mushed away. At 100% comparison, they look identical. But if you punch in at like 400%, the Burano's no noise reduction is actually nicer, and I'm glad that it exists. If we compare that to the H265, again, that's that XAVC HI with no noise reduction, we get 12. Now this is weird. That means that the H265, which we've known in the past, sort of gets a higher score and sort of deals with noise on its own. And remember I said that the H265 seemed to be like the blacks were pushed down a little bit. But even with no noise reduction in the H265 mode, we get 12 stops, which is a huge jump from the 10.9. And if we add the medium noise reduction on the H265, we get 12.6, and now we're in the territory of what the Alpha 1 would score, like a high 12, which means that if you shoot H265 with medium noise reduction on this, you're basically baking in all the aspects that the Alpha 1 does automatically, and you end up with the same dynamic range and the same image, which is why I think they probably would have the same starting point. If all the codecs were the same in both cameras, I feel like we would get very similar numbers in all the different codecs. Now, if we drop that 8K H265 on a 4K timeline with no noise reduction, so now we get oversampling, we get 12.5. And if we put the 8K on a 4K timeline, H265 with medium noise reduction, we get 12.9, which is similar to the pixel binned 4K that you get on the Alpha 1. But isn't it weird that I'm trying to see if I can get the Burano to score as highly as the Alpha 1? It's kind of strange. Although again, I can't turn those things off in the Alpha 1, which I kind of wish that I could. They should make an FX version of the Alpha 1 that isn't $25,000, but that's like $8,000 or something. Put a fan in it, put that gray, FX3 body on it, give us noise reduction control, shutter angle, all that kind of stuff. Then you got yourself a camera right over there. I did the 6K full frame C mode on a 6K timeline. We got 12.8, which means that whatever process Sony's doing where they're like, we're shrinking it down, then we're expanding it, we're oversampling it, we're doing proprietary stuff, it's crushing some noise too while you're at it. And then just for fun, I did the 5.8K modes. If you put the 5.8K Super 35 on a 5.8K timeline, you get about 11.5. If you take the 8K RAW in camera and put it directly on a 4K timeline with no noise reduction is 12.2, and with noise reduction at medium is 12.8. Now, if you saw on social before I made this video, I put a little post up showing my test rig for comparing the Alpha One to the Burano, and they were kind of stacked on top of each other. And some people asked what the, cage parts that I had on the Burano were in that post and how I was able to sort of support it all. And so I want to give a shout out to Condor Blue for sending over, when they heard that I had the Burano, they sent over their cage parts and allowed me to do some weird things like move this top handle that comes with the Burano back into a weird position so I could mount the Alpha One in the front. That's not what it's for though. They're for more logical purposes than that. But I've got a few other parts here. So here, this is actually two different pieces and they're interchangeable. So you could put this one on the front or that one on the back, whichever you preferred, but they're pretty symmetrical, which is great. They have, NATO rails on the front. Both sides have sensor plane demarcation. So if you need to and with little threaded inserts, if you want to put a little pin in there and then measure your to subject distance, you can do that. And you can opt for a little side piece that comes down here, which puts the, RE rosette thing for the grip and everything comes along the side. And they even have a little one that goes on the side here with a little shoe. If you wanted to put one of those little wireless mic kits with a cold shoe, you can clip it in there. It's pretty cool. And apparently there's even more parts than what they sent me. So I'll put a link in the description if you're planning on, rigging out a Burano and you want to see what they got. I like them. They look good. They look good on the gray cameras. And they add more holes to your camera. Now that you've seen the test results with the actual facts, let's go and do some heavily opinion-based ranting. Again, that you should take with a grain of salt because what do I know? I don't work on film sets or shoot documentaries. However, from somebody who cares a lot about value and can compare a lot of cameras, I do have trouble with the value proposition of the Burano. Allow me to explain. I've already established that it's basically an Alpha One from a sensor performance perspective. In fact, it's slightly worse. The rolling shutter is worse and it doesn't have as many modes as the Alpha One when it comes to speeding that up if you want to improve the rolling shutter. And dynamic range-wise, it's the same once you've sort of fully processed your image. The only advantage this has is that you don't have to fully process your image if you don't want to, but I suppose you could go the Ninja ProRes RAW route with the Alpha One and then it starts to kind of equalize those differences. So a lot of what's going to set the Burano apart are things that are very specific and hard to tell that they're worth 5 times the price. An example one would be Genlock. So if you're doing XR or some kind of virtual production thing, it's got it, and then other cameras don't. So, but then you can make the argument, what about the FX9? Because in the 6K mode, the FX9 has similar rolling shutter and has Genlock and is like half the price. So if you just need Genlock, and that's really your defining need, is this what you're going to spend? And then what about the fact that you can get like a Venice One used or other cameras that probably have Genlock for less than 25K? You can't spend 25K just for Genlock is my point. But it is something that sure as hell the mirrorless cameras can't provide. Now, like I said, I haven't tested the XLR inputs, the time code or whatever. I'm just assuming that this many generations in, Sony has those things figured out and they can nail them. And so we'll assume that they all work excellently. But again, that's not really a separating fact because you can get a module. Sony makes one for mirrorless cameras that gives you XLR inputs, and you can figure out time code and stuff like that for your mirrorless. So you can rig it all up. You can rig it up in a V-mount plate. You could put cage parts on it. So all that isn't like what makes it a cinema body isn't something that you can't turn a mirrorless camera into with hurdles. Now, yeah, you've got your sort of like nice, all your buttons are on one side. I've never been sold on that, but again, I don't work on film sets. I find this thing and this type of interface to be more cumbersome to use for multiple reasons. One, anytime you switch modes, the camera like restarts. If you want to get in a menu, you got to hold buttons. There's like weird dials and stuff. When you've held a camera in your hand for so long and you're like, I can just do everything with my thumbs, it feels so much faster. It's like comparing a joystick to a PS5 controller, in my opinion. It just doesn't, it's not the same. But again, this is what works in certain industry things. So if you need that, there it is. And you can't really mod that out too much onto a mirrorless camera. And then you could say it's got built-in NDs. And that's also true. And built-in NDs are sweet compared to putting weird screw-on fillers on the front of your lenses. Although if we're making a cinema rig, you would use a matte box and use high-quality filters and not ones that, you rotate and do weird things. But Robert Machado did a great video. Also, that's the video you should be watching instead of this bozo ramble about it because he's actually used the camera in proper applications. I really like his video, by the way. It's excellent. Really objective, really balanced. Go check it out. he talked a lot about the IR pollution that he was getting on this camera. He showed some shots where your blacks were like red and it was strong and it was bad. So then you'd have to say, and he's talking about putting filters on the front of his lenses to get rid of that. So now I'm thinking, well, if you're putting filters on the front of your lenses anyway, how advantageous is that built-in ND? You know, how is that a selling point now? Well, it's got IBIS and it's got autofocus and it's got ND. Okay, and that's true. And I did do some mild testing on the IBIS and the autofocus, and they're both good. For some reason, the cinema camera autofocus always feels to me slightly worse than the mirrorless autofocus, which makes sense. If the Alpha 1 is one generation ago, and the current generation is the one with all the AI processing chips, like the A7R5 and onward, this camera would be the generation before the Alpha 1 in terms of how I feel like it performs. Small things, like I pointed it at my kid who was drinking from his like little sippy cup. And when he had the cup here, both had eye, and it was both great. When he brought the sippy cup up, the Alpha 1 was like, there's still an eye there. This camera was like, I don't see an eye. And it just like did some weird face thing and like tracked the cup. And it was still acceptable, but the Alpha 1 was better. Certainly usable, and it's certainly very good, but it's not the best. And yet this camera costs so much, right? And then IBIS, the same thing. It's there and it's cool, but there's a lot of limitations on when you can use it. Like there's multiple modes of the IBIS, right? Just like on a mirrorless camera. But what's cool with the Alpha 1 is that say you were in that 4K pixel bin mode, well, now you can turn everything on. You can turn IBIS on active, you can do whatever, because it's just deciding how much of the 8K it's going to read from. Where on this camera, because so many of the modes were about that crazy full frame 6K crop thing they're doing, or the 8K modes, you can't really turn everything on until you're like at Super 35, and also not in RAW. Because if you're in RAW, you can't, you know, turn on a lot of the weird things like focus breathing compensation, stuff like that. So again, it's cool. It has so many mirrorless camera functions. Like I didn't mention, but you've got distortion compensation for when you're using E-mount lenses, obviously, right? You got distortion, you got peripheral illumination, you got focus breathing compensation, you've got those active stabilization modes. They're all in there, but you're only using them when you're already at a crop and you're not in RAW. So you're shooting Super 35, you know, HEVC mode, then you can turn a bunch of stuff on. And at that point, it's like, I'm just using a mirrorless camera, and you're not using the ND filters because they have IR pollution. So you're putting filters on the front of your lenses. It gets really confusing. So then it becomes, well, this thing is a lot more reliable, and I cannot take that away from it. This thing is a tank. It's heavy, but it's built like a tank. It's got a fan inside with control on it, all the things that the Alpha 1 doesn't have. And I feel like in a hot environment, this camera is gonna dump all over the Alpha 1 in terms of performance. But there are things you can do with the Alpha 1. I've shown some pretty cool stuff in my videos where if you put a Ninja 5 on it, you can set the camera to 8K, but record externally to the Ninja 5 in 4K, basically recording an oversampled 4K mode automatically to an SSD in ProRes, if you want, ProRes 422 10-bit. That's a great codec to work with. Put a dummy battery in this thing, rig it all out with a cage, and it's not gonna be this reliable, but I've never had that overheat, and I can record for a really long time with the camera set to 8K. If you wanna record 8K internal RAW, then yeah, you're gonna need a big monster with like a fan and stuff like that. But there's media differences too. Like this thing's using, Sony sent over with it their new 2 terabyte CF Express Type B cards, 2 tough cards. I don't know what these things cost, but they're probably like thousands of dollars, right? And I don't get to keep these, by the way. They go back, but they're part of the trial unit here. And so that media is crazy expensive. Where my little ProRes 422 thing, it's the cost of a Ninja and some SSDs. So it's hundreds of dollars, not thousands of dollars in media. And once you have that set up, you can have a whole fleet of SSDs if you wanted to swap them out. Now, I'm not saying that it's equal. I'm just saying that it can get you most of the way there for only spending $1,000 extra for the Ninja, the SSDs, the dummy battery, and some parts on top of this price than all of this. This is just why I'm having this sort of like value crisis. And I really can't stress enough how much I want them to put in that 4K pixel bin mode in this Burano. I feel like that would take away like 30% of my complaints and maybe more of other people's, because then you'll be like, hey, you've got an 8 millisecond mode. Maybe it'd be slightly worse than the other one. So maybe let's call it 9 milliseconds. You got a 9 millisecond mode in there now, and it's full frame, and it's 4K, and you can do up to 120. Because again, with these cinema cameras, with the Sony interface with cinema cameras, even that's harder. You want to shoot in 4K 120, you got to go into one of the crop modes. Then you have to turn on S&Q. Then you have to dial your S&Q up to 120. You can't just go menu 4K 120, let's roll, baby. And like your field of view didn't change. Over here, it's more tedious. And you'd think, if anything, this should be faster. Like almost like you press the 4K 120 button or something. That's not a thing. You got to go in and change everything. The camera restarts. It's frustrating. Now, I know there's some people listening to this and probably be like, yeah, that's all of Sony's, F whatever line. And it's like, yeah, I guess so. And that's true. But it doesn't mean that it's not tedious, And then one more thing. This is more of just like a bug report. Maybe it's not a bug report, but it might be a condition of having all these different modes that have different rules and needing to reboot and everything. But say you thought, well, Gerald, can you do some of your HDMI ninja tricks on this camera and, circumvent some of the issues? Yes and no. Yes, there's a cool thing, which is that if you do record out to the Ninja via HDMI, the issues between the RAW and the H265 looking different, they go away. So it makes me feel like those differences in how they look might actually be on the NLE side and not what the camera's outputting. However, anytime you change anything in this camera, the HDMI modes change and it doesn't remember. To be more specific, say you're in 8K and you're like, you have to go to HDMI. So you want to turn the HDMI on 4K out over HDMI. Cool. Now you look at your monitor, boom, we're getting a 4K signal. But then you say to yourself, oh, actually, you know what? I want to switch to H265 and record H265 internal. Or I want to switch to that 6K full frame crop mode thing. Or I want to switch to Super 35 4K. Or I want to switch to be able to do 4K 120. Any one of those times you switch, you have to go back into this HDMI menu, which is buried, and then redetermine which resolutions are coming out of SDI, which ones are coming out of HDMI, because not all of them are available in each mode. So it's almost like that resets. And what's annoying is even if you went through and for 8K, you're like, for 8K, give me 4K over HDMI. For 6K, give me 4K over HDMI. For whatever, and you go through, then when you go back to the 8K one, it forgot it again. So it doesn't remember what HDMI output you want for each, unless like you go in and you save a complete memory profile for each mode, and then you got to load that up each time. Again, more tedium, right? On this camera, you just say, always put 4K over HDMI. Thank you. And it's done. Everything is here. But there isn't one thing I can think of that it does better than any other camera that does that thing on its own. Even if it's like, how fast can you shoot 8K with 12.5 stops of dynamic range? It's like, well, not quite as fast as the Alpha 1. Well, can you shoot 4K as fast as the A7S III? I cannot, unless I do a 2x crop. There's always like a caveat. I am happy, however, that it exists because it's like, look what can exist. And I always have sort of a promise for the future, not so much about buying this and getting firmware updates, more of the fact that this exists. I'm not saying that they're going to be able to take this mechanism and stick it in something, but imagine if they could, or imagine that other brands can look at this and say, look what can be done. That is fascinating. And that makes me really like that this exists. Because imagine if somebody took a faster sensor and stuck this same IBIS ND module, but learned from the IR pollution and fixed that, and then put it in another camera that cost $12,000. The Burano made that possible. And then that $12,000 camera becomes, 2 years from now, somebody's making a video that's like the greatest camera of all time, or whatever. Like that would now, this paves the road for that. So I love that this exists as a proof of concept. And I don't want to just make this seem like I was just hating on this camera. But I fell into the hype, of like 25K Burano. It's like a Venice, but it does so much and it's going to solve everybody's problems everywhere. I don't know that it does. I do believe, though, that there are going to be some people, even when I just made this whole rant, that are just seeing the check marks of like, I needed that, I need that, I need that, I don't care about that, I don't care. And they're like, this is the perfect camera for me. I really do think this is going to be the absolute perfect camera for some key people. I guess I'm just saying, if they had to make this somewhat flawed jack of all trades to open the door for a future master of all, then I think it was worth it. I just don't think for the average person, it's the definitive answer that we were hoping for. All right, I'm done.